China didn't fire a missile. It opened a bank. In just 60 days, Beijing slashed its U.S. Treasury holdings to $760 billion, imported 127 metric tons of gold, and launched financial outposts in Hong Kong and Singapore. While Washington tries to cut China off from World Bank funding, China's writing its own loans, with its own rules, and countries are lining up to take the deal. This isn't diplomacy. It's the quiet launch of a financial empire. And the U.S. may have just triggered its own collapse. In April 2025, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent quietly told the Asian Development Bank to freeze new loans to China, aiming to restrict Beijing's access to multilateral capital. But within weeks, China's response wasn't protest. It was expansion. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, China's own multilateral lender, announced plans to open branches in Hong Kong and Singapore, two of Asia's top financial hubs. With $57.4 billion in assets in 38 member countries already under its belt, the AIIB's move signals not retreat, but offensive. According to Bloomberg, China has already committed over $52 billion through the AIIB, much of it targeting energy and transport, the same sectors once funded by Western institutions. As the U.S. pressures the IMF and World Bank to isolate Beijing, Beijing is reshaping the terrain entirely, making loans that flow right back to Chinese contractors and industries. If Washington hoped to box China out, it may have just forced it to build a bigger ring. Bessent's strategy to tie U.S. financial support to World Bank and IMF reform hinged on limiting China's influence, but it may have exposed America's own. At the IMF's April meeting, Bessent blasted mission creep in multilateral lending, demanding the institutions graduate China from developing status. Yet, the AIIB continues to attract U.S. allies like Germany and the UK, both full members, undermining Washington's leverage. Reuters reports that Bessent connected a $4 billion U.S. contribution to the World Bank's Poorest Country Fund directly to China-specific reforms, essentially turning U.S. loan guarantees into political bargaining chips. But Beijing, flush with a $1 trillion trade surplus, isn't begging for approval. Instead, it's issuing its own loans, often with fewer conditions and more immediate results. This raises a serious question. If America's loan diplomacy now comes with caveats, while China's comes with cranes and engineers, who looks like the more reliable partner? The AIIB isn't playing catch-up. It's underwriting a parallel global financial network, one where China's priorities shape outcomes. The AIIB has already funded 45 energy sector projects, according to its 2024 disclosures, accounting for over a third of its approved loans. Many of these projects operate in Belt and Road-aligned nations, further blending China's infrastructure diplomacy with its financial expansion. The U.S., notably absent, holds no voting power, while China commands 26.6%, enough to unilaterally veto any strategic decision. This mirrors America's own control at the IMF, but it flips the narrative. China's capital now dictates global development agendas, particularly in Asia and the Middle East. The Wall Street Journal reported last month that the AIIB has begun encouraging members to accept loans in yuan, a subtle but potent challenge to dollar dominance. With each project built and repaid in Chinese currency, Beijing isn't just financing infrastructure. It's rewriting the manual on global influence, and Washington's tools may no longer fit the job. When Uzbekistan accepted a $75 million AIIB loan for renewable energy, it seemed like progress, but the deeper mechanics revealed something else. The project's key technologies, wind turbines from Vision and Sany, batteries likely from KTL or BYD, were all Chinese. Power China, a state-owned firm, oversees construction. According to a March 2025 project brief obtained by Nikkei Asia, over 90% of expenditures will cycle back into Chinese firms. It's not aid. It's industrial recycling. And the payoff is twofold. China gets foreign influence while boosting domestic supply chains. AIIB loans increasingly resemble vendor financing packages, where infrastructure development comes bundled with Beijing's manufacturing dominance. Western development banks, by contrast, often require open bidding and local sourcing, slowing projects and reducing returns. So while the U.S. criticizes debt trap diplomacy, Beijing's model quietly builds loyalty through economic interdependence, and the more countries plug into that loop, the harder it becomes to unplug. Washington believed isolating China from the Bretton Woods institutions would freeze its global ambitions. Instead, it created a vacuum, and Beijing filled it. At the ASEAN GCC summit in May 2025, China called for a dynamic economic circle linking Southeast Asia and the Gulf, backed by AIIB financing. Days later, the bank announced it would increase lending in local currencies, particularly the yuan, to reduce dollar dependency. According to the Financial Times, cross-border yuan settlements surged 35% in Q1 2025, the fastest quarterly increase in over a decade. In real-world terms, this isn't theory. It's logistics. Solar projects in Indonesia, hydro plants in Central Asia, and fiber optic corridors through Africa. All funded, supplied, and politically anchored by Beijing. And while Washington demands institutional reforms, Beijing is executing field work. One airport, one turbine, one repayment cycle at a time. So let's stop asking whether China is catching up. The real question is whether the U.S. even realizes it's now playing a different game entirely. In Q1 2025, yuan-based international payments surged by 35% year-over-year, according to SWIFT data, marking the fastest pace since 2016, and signaling a strategic pivot as China shifts global lending away from dollars. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, backed by Beijing, has quietly begun offering local currency loans across Asia and Africa, prompting central banks from Indonesia to Nigeria to boost their renminbi reserves, Reuters reports. At the same time, China's central bank has slashed its U.S. Treasury holdings to just $760 billion, down from over $1.1 trillion 5 years ago, while increasing its official gold reserves for the 18th consecutive month. According to the World Gold Council, China imported 127.5 metric tons of gold in April alone, despite bullion hitting an all-time high above $3,500 per ounce. This isn't about hedging, it's about insulation. With every loan written in renminbi and every ton of gold stacked into vaults, Beijing is building a financial firewall against dollar risk. But what happens when borrowers start treating yuan not as a hedge, but a habit? Washington still wields institutional might, but its grip is loosening in rooms it no longer controls. While the U.S. pressures the IMF to scrutinize China's opaque currency practices, per Treasury Secretary Bessent's April statement, China continues expanding its financial footprint via institutions the U.S. doesn't even belong to. At the AIIB, where China holds 26.6% voting power and the U.S. has zero representation, projects are rapidly scaling. From ports in Kenya to rail lines in Uzbekistan, with no alignment to Western lending norms. Germany, France, and the UK are active AIIB members, a fact that undercuts the narrative of Western unity. Even World Bank President Ajay Banga, in remarks this May, acknowledged that U.S.-led reforms cannot move forward without serious buy-in from other major economies. The irony? As Washington demands multilateral compliance, some of its allies are quietly adopting China's bilateral playbook. So if the U.S. still sees itself as the sheriff, what does that make the rest of the posse?